Morning, everybody, and I'm not sure what my bigger live is doing, but there are all sorts of funny things happening on that one. But we're also here on YouTube, which is a lot of fun, and we are here for some reading, which is a great way to start the day. I'm going to turn on some light because there's not a lot of light here. Give me 1 second. Oh, that one's already on. There we go. And we are going to be, well, we were going to be reading Rich Dad Poor Dad, which is really exciting. We're going to be doing some things around that video-wise and other things that I want to make in order to be able to help everybody with their finances and talk about things that are interesting. But right now, we are going to be doing The Art of Thinking Clearly, which is a good book. If you would like to read more or know more, you can obviously get the book. But there are also some recordings in YouTube of me already reading some chapters of the book, which is a lot of fun. And let's have a look where we were up to. Last time we did chapter 13, lucky 13. Even true stories are fairy tales, the story bias. And today we're up to chapter 14, why you should keep a diary, the hindsight bias. This one is going to be very interesting. Okay, so let's get into it, because I know that some of you might need to go to work and do other things. So here we go. I came across the diaries of my great uncle recently. In 1932, he emigrated from a tiny Swiss village to Paris to seek his fortune in the movie industry. In August 1940, 2 months after Paris was occupied, he noted, "Everybody is certain that the Germans will leave by the end of the year." Their officers also confirmed this to me. "England will fall as fast as France did, and then we will finally have our Parisian lives back, albeit as part of Germany." The occupation lasted 4 years. In today's history books, the German occupation of France seems to form part of a clear military strategy. In retrospect, the actual course of the war appears the most likely of all scenarios. Why? Because we have fallen victim to the hindsight bias. Very true on this one. So very often we don't realize that things are going to be looking, or they look very simple when we look back from where we are. But when we remember the moment, if we were in that moment, luckily we haven't experienced World War II, so we weren't in that moment, even though we're experiencing history every single day, but that's another story. It's interesting, and it'll talk more about this, so let's have a look. Let's take a more recent example. In 2007, economic experts painted a rosy picture for the coming years. However, just 12 months later, the financial markets imploded. Asked about the crisis, the same experts enumerated its causes. Monetary expansion under Greenspan, lax validation of mortgages, corrupt rating agencies, low capital requirements, and so forth. In hindsight, the reasons for the crash seem painfully obvious. The hindsight bias is one of the most prevailing fallacies of all. We can aptly describe it as the "I told you so" phenomenon. In retrospect, everything seems clear and inevitable. So I'm just looking forward to reading the rest of this. There's not that much to say because I'm sure that we've all had disagreements with people as well, where we said one thing and they said something else, and then life has happened, and then you come back, and of course, one person can justify that they're right, and the other person will argue that might argue that they're also right, and it becomes a question of he said, she said. Wow, that's difficult to say. He said, she said. That's a tongue twister. And if you haven't written it down, then who knows what was really said at the beginning, because now you've experienced this thing and it can be quite traumatic, and you forget what you said at the beginning. If a CEO becomes successful due to fortunate circumstances, he will, looking back, rate the probability of its success a lot higher than it actually was. Similarly, following Ronald Reagan's massive election victory over Jimmy Carter in 1980, commentators announced his appointment to be foreseeable, even though the election lay on a knife edge until a few days before the final vote. Today, business journalists opined that Google's dominance was predestined, even though each of them would have snorted that such a prediction had such a prediction been made in 1998. That's a very interesting one, isn't it? So everybody says that, of course, Google was going to rise to fame. However, there were a lot of companies that wanted to be Google and who were doing similar things at that time, but only Google was the one that made it all the way through. So they never said it was foreseeable that the other companies who were possibly doing the same thing and possibly doing just as good of a job, that they weren't going to make it. So it's interesting, isn't it, how we like to think that we understand how things happen from the past and how we knew that they were going to happen, or we knew that something wasn't going to happen, but really we wouldn't have known, and we only know what's happened now as opposed to what happened in the past. One particularly blundering example, nowadays it seems tragic, yet completely plausible, that a single shot in Sarajevo in 1940 would totally upturn the world for 30 years and cost 50 million lives. Every child learns this historical detail in school, but back then, nobody would have dreamed of such an escalation. It would have sounded too absurd. So why is the hindsight bias so perilous? Well, it makes us believe we are better predictors than we actually are, causing us to be arrogant about our knowledge and consequently to take too much risk. And not just with global issues. Have you heard? Sylvia and Chris aren't together anymore. It was always going to go wrong. They were just so different, or they were just so similar, or they spent too much time together, or even they barely saw one another. Yes, it's interesting how the same thing can have different causes according to different people, and yet it leads to the same thing. So, yes, it's an interesting bias to pay attention to. Overcoming the hindsight bias is not easy. Studies have shown that people who are aware of it fall for it just as much as everyone else. So I'm very sorry, but you've wasted your time reading this chapter. I don't think so. If you're still with me, I have one final tip, this time from personal rather than professional experience. Keep a journal. Write down your predictions for political changes, your career, your weight, the stock market, and so on. Then, from time to time, compare your notes with actual developments. You will be amazed at what a poor forecaster you are. Don't forget to read history too, not the retrospective, compacted theories compiled in textbooks, but the diaries, oral histories, and historical documents from that period. That is very interesting. When you read diaries from the Second World War, from all of these periods in history, you'll find that what people were predicting or what they thought was going to happen isn't necessarily what would end up happening. So it's better to just have a look at things from your own perspective and make your decisions based off of as much information and knowledge as you can get. And then once you've done that, you have to live with that decision and you'll understand that life isn't predictable. We can't predict what the future will bring. So we need to do our best to get as much information as possible, use it as wisely as possible in order to be able to get the outcome that we want. And sometimes life will happen to go with us, and sometimes life will be against us. But we don't want to we don't want to create the idea in ourselves that we are the perfect predictors, that we know exactly what's going to happen and how it's going to happen, because then we can start making some really big mistakes and not pay attention to being careful, because of course this stock market crash won't happen, and then we get wiped out. So that's what we need to be careful of. If you can't live without news, read newspapers from 5, 10, or 20 years ago. That's an interesting way of doing it. This will give you a much better sense of just how unpredictable the world is. Yes, we were meant to be, in the 1980s, I think they said that we were going to be living in an ice age right now. Hindsight may provide temporary comfort to those overwhelmed by complexity, but as for providing deeper revelations about how the world works, you'll benefit by looking elsewhere. There we go. That's an interesting one. The hindsight bias, chapter 14. And then tomorrow we're going to have chapter 15. Why you systematically overestimate your knowledge and abilities. This one's called the overconfidence effect. This one will be interesting. So I'm looking forward to seeing you for that one tomorrow. Have a great day today, everybody. I'm sure you've got some, I'm sure each of these chapters, whether you agree or disagree, and that's the interesting thing. So I don't always agree with every single one of these chapters in the book. But it's good to open yourself up to debate and thinking about it. And each of those chapters makes you think and gives you some things to challenge yourself on. so that you can have a look at what you want to change in your life to become better. And that's what life is all about, isn't it? Just having a look and evaluating what happened so that you can make changes so that you're able to achieve your goals, so that you can do things a little bit better, so you can be more pleasant to other people, and whatever else it is that we want to achieve. So that's what I'm going to leave today. Have a wonderful day, and I'll see you all tomorrow morning.